So as we continue on the plant kingdom, we're going to look at our last two groups of plants, and these are the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. And the thing about the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms are these are the plants that you're most familiar with. They're most abundant in the current environment. And now the gametophyte is going to be completely dependent on the sporophyte in these two groups. So we're going to look at first the Gymnosperms, non-flowering, seed, and vascular plants. And then the Angiosperms are flowering and seed and vascular plants. So we've seen vasculature. We saw a vascular plant with the ferns. What we haven't seen yet is the seed. So with the evolution of the seed, we see the Gymnosperms. And then a continued modification, kind of the delivery mechanism that comes with the seed, is the flower. With the flower also comes fruit, that we don't see proper fruit in the Gymnosperms. And we also see then in many types of Gymnosperms and Angiosperms what's called secondary growth. And this is what you think of as wood, right? So you chop a pine tree down, that wood is all secondary growth, and we'll talk about that as we get into growth. But these are the characteristics that you will see as we talk about these two groups that makes them different. So again, the gametophyte is going to be dependent on the sporophyte, and in fact the gametophyte is going to be so small that oftentimes you need a microscope to see it. So we've gone really to the far end of this pendulum of an alternation of generations. So the Gymnosperms, vascular, seed, non-flowering group. And this is Coniferophyta is 80% of all Gymnosperms. So this is division Coniferophyta. Gymnosperm means naked seed. It means it doesn't have the fruit surrounding it. And this is a very, very successful group, especially in the northern taiga, which is a biome that we are a part of, right? So you think about the pine and fir forests. These are all conifers. So these are also some of the largest organisms on the planet. The sequoia, giant redwoods, these are huge, huge organisms, a ton of biomass. These are conifers. Now, the key to the Gymnosperms and ultimately the Angiosperms is really going to be the seed. We have a plant that has alternation of generations, but because the gametophyte is so reduced, it's never going to leave the sporophyte. So again, we're going to use that same color coding here, and we're going to zoom in on a cross-section of what is the developing seed. So think about this as in the developing pine cone on a pine tree, for example, and we'll look at that life cycle in just a second. But if you zoom in and cut it in half, you would see that you've got all this brown tissue, this is diploid tissue, that has gone through meiosis to form a spore. In this case, it's called the megaspore. And that megaspore then has half the ploidy. Remember, sporophytes make spores. Those spores grow up into gametophytes, and so that spore starts to divide and becomes the female gametophyte. So the female gametophyte then is a very small portion of tissue that is retained within what we call the ovule, and that is part of the pine cone. So that female gametophyte then has archegonia and then is waiting for the sperm to get there for fertilization. Now the cool thing about the male gametophyte in the Gymnosperms is that it also is vastly reduced. In fact, it's so small, it's an individual pollen grain. And if you're as small as an individual pollen grain, you actually aren't swimming sperm anymore. You don't produce swimming sperm. The whole package, the whole male gametophyte, is delivered through the air. So we've eliminated now the need for water for fertilization of the egg. So that then, when the pollen lands on the pine cone, it can fertilize the egg, and then that will close up, become the seed, and then the tiny embryo inside will grow. And so, in fact, what you see here in the Gymnosperm seed here on the right, you see the seed coat, which is derived ultimately from grandma as a sporophyte, a diploid tissue. And then the food supply that they have labeled here is actually haploid tissue. That's the remnants of the female gametophyte. That's its baby. And then the grandchild would be the new embryo, which is now a sporophyte again, diploid tissue. So 3 generations in that seed. So this is maybe a little bit confusing, but we're going to go through it again now, looking at the whole life cycle of the pine. So let's start with that pine tree, and it's not brown because it's sick, it's brown because it's all diploid tissue. So that pine tree there standing there, you zoom in, you have both male cones and female cones. The male cones produce pollen, which is the male gametophyte, and the female cones have ovules. Now, an ovule is, by definition, a structure that contains the female gametophyte. The ovule is the structure that will then develop after fertilization into a seed. So a seed is a mature ovule containing an embryo. It usually has a protective seed coat which is resistant to desiccation and harsh conditions. And that's going to be the key to the success from an evolutionary point of view of the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Because the seed is like this little super hibernation capsule for the baby, it can withstand harsh conditions. It can survive a winter. It can survive a period of drought. And then when the conditions are right, it can sprout and grow into the next generation of sporophyte. So on the male cones, you are producing pollen grains. The female cones have those ovules that have the female gametophyte inside. And when the pollen grains land on the female pine cone, the pollen tube grows into the pine cone, delivers the sperm, in essence. It's not really sperm, it's just a nucleus. You get fusion, and now you've got a sporophyte again that is diploid. All right. So if we look at these are male pine cones on a pine tree. Most people overlook these. When you think of a pine cone, you're almost always thinking of a female pine cone. That's woody, something you could chuck at someone else, right? That's a female pine cone. But in the male pine cones, we're developing pollen, and even the pollen grains of gymnosperms are very distinct. Many of them have these little wing-like structures. This is pine pollen that helps them float through the air. Because the gymnosperms are going to be dependent almost exclusively on physical means to distribute their pollen. So they're really wind pollination. And that's going to be one of the distinctions that we see between gymnosperms and angiosperms. Angiosperms are going to use what's called a biotic vector. They're going to use other things in many cases to deliver pollen, and we're going to find that to be even more efficient than the way the gymnosperms do it. So pollen is being dumped out. It's that yellow haze of dust, and those are all male gametophytes. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of gymnosperms. Another one that you may see around here as an ornamental tree is the ginkgo. And that's a cool, very, very old genus species, but it also happens to be a gymnosperm. All right. So, gymnosperms, non-flowering, seed, vasculature. Reproduction is independent of water. Why? Because of pollen. What is pollen? It's the male gametophyte. All right. The sporophyte is dominant. Most of the gymnosperms that you know are conifers in the phylum Coniferophyta. Clearly, we use gymnosperms for medicinal uses, paper, lumber. We build our shelter out of gymnosperms. Now, our last group are the angiosperms. And the angiosperms are very, very similar to the gymnosperms, but they add this new evolutionary adaptation called the flower. And angiosperms, in fact, are so successful that they are 80% of all land plants currently. So there was something about this difference between having a flower and not having a flower that made you incredibly successful reproductively. So the angiosperms now are kind of the predominant vegetation on the planet. So what is up with this flower? So we all know flowers, and so flowers are modified stems and leaves. And we'll talk about that as we talk about plant structure in just a little bit. But a flower always has 4 whorls in what's called a perfect flower. And that perfect flower would have a whorl or a circle of sepals. Right? This is a cross-section. A circle of sepals, a circle of petals, then a circle of stamen, which are the male parts of the flower, and then in the middle of the flower will be 1 or more carpels. Okay, it's also called a pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L. So in a perfect flower, not all flowers have all 4 whorls, but in a perfect flower, you have all 4 whorls, both male and female parts. And so this is now all sporophyte tissue. So when we look at the life cycle of the angiosperm, it's going to be similar to the life cycle of the gymnosperm in that the gametophyte is incredibly reduced in size. In fact, the reduction is so extreme in the angiosperms that the female gametophyte is only 8 cells. So they even just call it an embryo sac here, the female gametophyte. It's only 8 cells big. So very, very small. The male gametophyte, again, is just the pollen grain. Okay? And so what we have here on the left is the mature sporophyte, and the pollen then that is spread in some plants will self-fertilize and others will not. And that's like a whole week's worth of lectures if we wanted to talk about the details of that. But the pollen grains then, when they land on the stigma of the flower, so go back to that picture of the flower. So the carpel, the female parts of the flower, are made of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Now inside the ovary we see the ovule, which we've already learned about. The ovule is the structure that holds the female gametophyte and will become the seed. And so we have this new structure around the ovule called the ovary. And the ovary then is what will develop into the fruit of the plant. And so angiosperms then have a fruit, whereas gymnosperms do not. Now, not every fruit of an angiosperm is like an apple, right? It's not something you go, oh, that's juicy and delicious. That's not always the case. But it is, botanically speaking, a fruit if it is the mature ovary. All right, and we'll talk about this more in class and in lab. So what we have is then the pollen grains land on the stigma. They are going to send a pollen tube down into the ovary, deliver the sperm nucleus basically to the egg. You get fertilization. That zygote then develops. The zygote is the next generation. It's the sporophyte. It's diploid tissue. It will develop inside the seed, which is the tissue that was the ovule, and that will then develop inside a fruit. Okay. In this case, they show a fleshy fruit here. That fruit then is there for distribution of the seeds. It's a reward in many cases for the animal that distributes the seed. And that is really the key to the success of the gymnosperms. They have pollen that makes them independent of water for reproduction, but really it's about how you get that pollen from flower to flower, right? And whereas the gymnosperms are just dumping it out into the wind, and I have to put a bunch out there to make sure that it finds a female cone, what angiosperms do in many, many cases is use what's called a biological vector, a pollinator. So we talk about vectors, and the term vector has many, many different meanings, but in biology it means a carrier, right? And so in molecular biology we can talk about a vector, a plasmid, a piece of DNA that I'm going to use to carry another piece of DNA into an organism, or a virus as a vector, or a mosquito as a vector for disease. But in this case, we're talking about a biological vector, a pollinator, carrying pollen from flower to flower. And if I have a very, very specific delivery system, I don't need to produce as much pollen. And that's energetically more favorable. I don't have to dump a bunch of resources out there. So we have these pollinators that carry pollen from flower to flower, and that also then pushes what we call coevolution, when you have two or more interdependent species, each adapting to changes in the other. So when I have a flower that I'm going to for my food, and I'm being rewarded by going to more of them because I'm actually carrying pollen around as I do, then all of a sudden, if I have adaptations that make it easier for me to do that, or adaptations in the flower that make it easier for me to do that, everyone starts to evolve in this interdependent way, and it's called coevolution. All right? So again, all kinds of flower shapes, all kinds of flower displays, but ultimately that flower has an ovary, which develops into a fruit. So you can see berries here, and the dandelion, actually each one of those little dandelion things that flies through the air, that's a fruit, technically. All right. So again, it all comes back to the angiosperms, that flower. You should know the structure of the flower. This is a great slide to kind of memorize, be able to draw. And then we'll talk more about fruits and different kinds of fruits in class and in lab.